Is Gaurav here? Sorry, Margie, just one second.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm trying to unmute Dr. Raina and I'm not able to do that.
Okay. He looks mute even now. I mean,
so I can't even, there's no access as well. So okay. I'm wondering, I think I'm not a host. So
yeah.
Can you unmute him? Is it possible for you to do
I can try. Faculty, but now it is faculty.
Oh, you are the co-host now.
Hi Bala, you are a host now.
Okay.
Can you unmute Dr. Raina, please?
Yes. Hello. Hello, Dr. Raina, can you hear me?
Good evening, sir.
Very good evening. I can hear all of you.
Okay, just to give you a heads up, we are live on Facebook right now.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Great.
That's nice. So that will also get archived in Facebook, so one can see it later as well.
Yes.
Hello, Margie. Hello, Bala.
Hello, sir.
A very hearty welcome on behalf of all of us at the university, Margie.
Thank you so much.
In the first place, for having accepted our request to be a part of our, JKLU signature session series, and we have had 2 such wonderful sessions already.
Right.
And we look forward to Mythology Matters from you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for making me a part of JKLU.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much for coming over and being with us on this series.
It's my pleasure.
And also you are with us otherwise also on our board of studies. You guide us on state of affairs in the academic side, Institute of Design. So we value your inputs and look forward to continued association with you.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. The attendees are still coming. Already we've reached 45. So, but there are 95 people who have registered. Sorry, 111 who have registered. And so we could wait a couple of minutes.
There are some others also, Facebook may.
Yes, as well. That's correct.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the introduction, which which I got put together. When I put together the description for the session, I was asked how many people are going to present, because Margie actually wears different hats. She's a writer, editor, translator, researcher, and a teacher with over 4 decades of experience in the creative landscape.
Wow.
Having worked across media, she uses her scripts and videos to concoct designer courses for students as visiting faculty in various universities, of course, including JKLU. She teaches at NID, CET, NIFT, NIRMA, and MS University, Baroda. As a scriptwriter and associate editor of Amar, Chitra, Katha, and Tinkle, visual communication was a forte, which was further enhanced while scriptwriting for TV with Surabhi, which is a very popular program, and I'm hoping that Doordarshan will now revive it again. Khana Khazana, Yatra, and Gurukul. Storytelling is a forte, especially the Indian folk style that goes on and on and on. Looking forward to an enlightening session from Margie. Over to you, Margie.
Thank you. Thank you again, Bala, for inviting me and for making me a part of your Institute of Design. I'm especially looking forward to interacting with your students, whom I'm imagining are there at the other end.
They're all here, yes.
It's always difficult to transit from a real classroom to a virtual one, but I think this is the new reality, and we should all just enjoy it. Let me begin with the title itself. Why have I chosen to say that mythology matters? Of course, there is a play on words. Mythology matters in our lives, especially now in India, because the 2 serials, the 2 epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, are having a rerun. It is also strange that the stories you hear of the initial telecast were always full of empty streets because the Ramayana and Mahabharata were on. Now it's the reverse, because the streets are empty, for whatever reason, that you have Ramayana and Mahabharata being televised. So there is that link which has happened by itself. The other way I would explain my title is matters relating to mythology which I have learned over my years across the media. So I will be talking about matters related to mythology and why mythology matters in our lives, both the aspects. As I said, this is a good time to speak about mythology because everybody's mythology is being revised now. It is also an excellent time because in India, the lockdown is going to be forever linked to a mythological cue. Everybody is home today in India and elsewhere because of what we know as Lakshman Rekha. I'll be going into a little more detail later about Lakshman Rekha, but we all know whether or not we are delved into mythology, that's a line we don't cross. And that's a line meant for our safety. And somebody who's looking out for you has told you not to cross that line if you value your safety. So Lakshman Rekha has been like an instant code that everybody has understood. So it's a good time to talk about mythology now. What happens when you mention the word mythology, it's a little overwhelming in India especially, because we have, according to the scriptures, 33 crore Devi Devta, right? Now that's a huge number. And if I'm saying I'm going to talk about mythology, please don't presume I know 33 crores by name or that I'm going to discuss them. No, because that is just a figure of speech. There are just so many gods and goddesses in our world, in our divine world. So what happens in India when you discuss mythology, there is a little overwhelming response because everybody feels, oh my God, I don't know enough and I don't want to discuss it because I'll be found out that I don't know enough. It happens across India, across time. And if you have just take our two epics, just leave the rest of the scriptures aside and talk about only the Ramayana and Mahabharata. If you were to be given 1 rupee for everyone who confuses the Ramayana and Mahabharata characters, you'd be a millionaire. Everybody gets confused about who's where and how and why. Added to that confusion are the stories which bring the characters together. So there is a story of Bhim being obstructed by Hanuman, and you're not really sure how did they come together. They belong to different epics at different eras. So mythology is a little overwhelming and it is a little overpowering, and people do get afraid of being able to admit that they don't know. And I think it's very, very natural. We should take it, in our stride, because I remember when we were doing Mahabharata in Amar Chitra Katha, one of the associate editors used to joke about how if you ask people to name the Pandavas, it should be easy enough, they're just 5. So you would have a response like, Ek te Arjun, Ek te Bhim, Ek te Hor, or Ik Hor, Ek to main bhuli gaya. So actually you don't even remember the 5 people. It is very, very normal. And so it is okay not to know, but you have heard most of the stories at some point in your life. And so what happens is when you hear mythological stories, they're kind of reminder of what you have heard. It reignites your memories of stories heard, maybe not in great detail, but in bits and pieces or something that you have watched. The other response to mythology is 2 very diverse reactions. There are people who would take everything in mythology to be completely true, and they would be very hurt if you were to ever suggest that this is not, it didn't exist. Whereas there's another school of thought which says if it's mythology, it didn't happen. So it's mythical, mithya hai, and it's just stories. We don't take any of the positions. We discuss mythology as I have learned to admire and narrate it over my years across the media. Now, how do I fit in? Why am I daring to speak about mythology today? I shouldn't really, because my background is science. I studied science at the undergraduate and postgraduate level. And as most people who do science and engineering, they have a very healthy disdain about things which are not science and engineering. I mean, let's admit it. They feel that beyond this, there can't be anything which is worth knowing and remembering. So I was completely untouched by mythology and culture for a very, very long time. It through a very long circumstances, I found myself with India Book House and Amar Chitra Katha. And that's where the story begins. And probably, I don't know whether it was happen chance or some divine interference. I think somebody up there said, this one is a good one for writing our stories. Come, let's put her there. So I landed at India Book House and I learned mythology and Indian culture from the best person ever and the best brand ever in Amar Chitra Katha under Mr. Pai's editorship. So what happened is, for people who don't know, Amar Chitra Katha are Indian comics, which are now 50 years old. They have been telling stories of Indian mythology, culture, folk tales, biographies, history. There's a whole genre of stories which have been narrated through the years through Amar Chitra Katha. They're very popular and they're still a coveted and a collected item and passed on from generation to generation. But what happened was, by the time I joined Amar Chitra Katha, it had become something that people believed in. And for anybody who's been in this field, you realize when people look up at you as a source of authentic information, then the responsibility changes. So what happened was, at that point somewhere, Mr. Pai had gone for Mr. Anand Pai, who's the editor and who started Amar Chitra Katha and who needs to be given all the credit for the success that it has seen. That he went for a Ramayana seminar in Delhi, and there was some question about I think who was Ravan's mother or some question like that. And somebody from the audience said, it is Kekasi because Amar Chitra Katha mein kaha hai. So when he heard that, he was a little, he realized how seriously people are taking it, that it has become a secondary source of information. So when he came back from there, the rules, the editorial rules became very, very stringent. We not only took a single source for whatever we wrote, we quoted the source. We were very, very strict about adhering to the source, and also it was validated by experts for language and for content. So the editorial norms became very strict, and all of us learned how to write an Amar Chitra Katha so that there would be no questioning of how true it was to the source that it was quoted. So when I joined Amar Chitra Katha, Mahabharat was going on. Let me share with you just a minute. So here, let's just go over quickly with the definition of what mythology is: a collection of myths, especially belonging to a particular religion or a cultural tradition, and myths dealing with gods, demigods, legendary heroes of a particular people. So mythology is always fascinating. It always has characters which are larger than life, which really make our imagination really run in a direction which we would never have. And they're always fascinating and they're always larger than life. So mythology in that sense is a collective wisdom of a people, of a community of people that is passed on from generation to generation. So it is something that is very important to every culture and every group of people. As I said, when I joined Amar Chitra Katha, this was a very ambitious project of telling the Mahabharat story in what was meant to be the longest comic in the world. Mahabharat in 42 volumes of Amar Chitra Katha. Originally, I think 64 volumes were planned, and then we settled for 42. I came somewhere in the middle of this, maybe 2/3 down the line. And I edited and wrote many of the scripts. Now, when you're writing for children, at least in those days, and certainly in Amar Katha, it was very important not to depict violence, because children's literature is very careful about how you depict certain things, and you have to be, in a visual medium, you have to be all the more careful. But Mahabharata is about war. How can you avoid showing war in a story that is all about the war? So it had to be very, very sensitively done. And the comic techniques allows things to happen between panels. So between one panel and the other, you can have events happening which you don't want to depict in detail in the visual, or you can use the long shot. You can use a shot so the details are not there, or you use angles where the main character is shown in a way that it does not look very gory to the person who's reading it. So the Mahabharata in 42 volumes is very successful. It's still being bought, and many people, and it's a bound volume, which is it's a little detailed. It requires you to probably have a lot of time on your hands, and the language is of the kind that needs to be read out to a child. It is not as simple as the others, because if you're taking it from the source, it has that kind of seriousness of the language. So Mahabharata, I would, if I'm recommending it to a child who's very young, I would say it would be a readout format. But of course, the adults would be able to read it for themselves. After the Mahabharata was over, just a moment. The next title that I did was Bhagavad. Now that is the story of Krishna. Just a moment, I'm not able to get that. That's the story of Krishna from the Bhagavad. Now in that too, okay, just a moment. So in the Bhagavad, you have the story of Krishna, and you have a lot of details that need to be depicted. Now, supposing we're talking about Krishna who upholds the Govardhan mountain. How do we visualize it? In most of the dances and most of the sculptures, it is Krishna like this. He is holding the mountain aloft on his little finger. But when you're showing the actual process of the mountain being lifted, then you have to show how Krishna lifted the mountain. So then you have to go to the original source, where it says in the Bhagavad that Krishna lifts the mountain with the ease of a child picking up a mushroom. So obviously, though he holds it aloft in most sources on his little finger, right? When he's lifting it up, you need that detail, that visual detail of lifting it like this and then holding it in the palm of his hand. So when we are showing the, just a moment, so when you're showing the Govardhan mountain being lifted, then you have the story being depicted where you have the mountain being lifted in a certain way. Now, of course, there are many details. It's a story which is very, very engaging and easy to read for children, because it has all the adventures that the Krishna as a child has and meets all these demons and how he overpowers them. It's very fascinating. The language is really very simple. It's very easy for children to read. And it gives you the basic, the lovable Krishna that we are all familiar with. Now, this was my earlier interaction and my earlier contribution to the Amar Chitra Katha the mythology series. Of course, we did other stories which were historical and folktale, but these were the two main mythological stories that I did. Now, what happens is that once you have, at some point, Amar Chitra Katha went into television. So there was an attempt to show the Amar Chitra Katha series as a television live action series. And we did some programs with UTV, I think as a co-producer, and we had, I think 13 episodes were done. So I transited from comics to television. So I learned while riding with Amar Chitra Katha, I learned how television works, and we did a series of stories for television on Amar Chitra Katha, which was on Doordarshan, and maybe that will also be shown in due course. So what happened was that the fact that I did television and that I knew mythology was somewhere, it percolated in the ether. And I was asked to do help with this. So this is the only, I'm just quickly going over this. This is the only film that I have been associated with. This is a full-length Hindi film. And it's an adventure story, which is based on a map, which has a mythological aspect to it. So what happens is there's an archaeologist, and he leaves a map in which the kundal and the kavach of Karna is hidden somewhere, and through a series of mythological clues that you're supposed to find that treasure. Now, they needed somebody who had the mythology background, so I was roped in, and I worked for this film, and we did a series of options of what could be done, what would be a mythological clue that would take the story forward and make it an adventure, and yet it had to be something that the audience was familiar with, because you always have this factor when something is being shown on screen and you feel, oh, I know this, and that gives you the connect to the film. So what they did in this case was, because it was Karna, they had the clues that were based on Mahabharata. So the clue was that they reach a temple, and that is supposed to lead them to that mountain where the treasure is. And in the temple, there are clues written, etched on the walls. And one of the clues is who wrote the Mahabharata Kisne Likha. Right. So then they look around and try to see if there's Vedyas, and they can't find it. And then they ask each other, Kisne Likha. So this is who wrote it, right? So when you ask the question again, then it indicates that it is the writing, it is the scribe who actually wrote the Mahabharata. And even if we have a very little knowledge, we all know about Ganesh and his writing the Mahabharata and the need to write it non-stop. And we know that story. So the clue then goes to Ganesh. And then we also know that at some point he needs to, when he's writing, he needs to break his tusk and write with it. So that was the third clue. So in that film, they touch the tusk of the sculptor there, icon there, and then I think the mountain opens or whatever. So it was my understanding of how in popular culture, certain things are so embedded that they immediately resonate with the people who are watching it. This was the only film that I have been associated, and there's a little credit line at the end. Again, going back to the fact of doing Amar Chitra Katha for television. Now, when we were doing, the challenge is that when you have a mythological story being told like this, if I'm narrating it, or if I'm just telling a group of people, or if it's in a village or pal and you're talking to a group of people or a temple, there is a lot of flexibility, and you can go into a lot of detail, you can bring in a lot of description. The moment you go into a visual medium, the moment you have a comic or you have a film or you have television, you have to populate that with visual imagery. And that is very, very demanding and sometimes very difficult. So one of the stories that was chosen for the television, the Doordarshan Amar Chitra Katha series was Shakuntala. Now, we know that Shakuntala is found, is left by the Apsara Menaka in the ashram. So the production people had a real challenge. They had to find a newborn baby. They had to find white birds, which were Shakuntal birds. And the baby and the bird had to be kept under a tree for a while till the shot could be taken. So it was a very demanding thing. The baby had to be brought. The baby's mother was there. They were the birds, and we had to see that the birds would not, be far enough from the baby. So it was a very demanding exercise to take it from the comic to the television medium. And also in Shakuntala, also we know that Shakuntala has a spotted deer as her companions, and how difficult it is to have animals during shooting. And this was pre-digital time, so you couldn't have, as we have nowadays, digitized animals or done in post-production. So that was a real challenge, whether or not to have spotted deer around her. There was also very interestingly the details about how I was involved with this television series as a person who would validate the the details. So to see that the Amar Katha detailing and the values were sustained in the television. So when I would also kind of suggest what costume, she would be wearing. So at one point, and I said that in one of the scenes, because Avidya and Shakuntalam has the greater detail of what Shakuntala wears. So I said she wears pearls. And so the costume designer said, no, it's not possible because pearls are only Japanese. And I realized how confused we are. Pearls are all over. It was only artificial pearls which were then popular that were earlier made in Japan. So these kind of arguments one had to face during, but you learn when you switch from one medium to the other, the demands of the medium and the need to adhere to the authenticity of the original story, because that is something that one has to do. Now, coming to this, I had worked in between before this. I had worked with the Sagars and in a program called Gurukul, which I'll mention later, which was excerpts from all their serials like Ramayana and the Gita, and which was like a magazine program. So I was by that time comfortable in the television medium. So what happened was that somebody had worked with once called me up and said, can you give me the shlok of the Lakshman Rekha? And this was late at night, shootings of course are crazy timings, and said and I said, I don't have it on hand. I don't have Ramayana one side and Mahabharata one side of my bedstead. But anyway, I looked for the detail and I had to call her up and say, there is no such shlok. You'll just have to quote whatever you want to quote. So this was in my mind when we decided to do multiple volume Ramayana for Amar Katha. So what happened is, as I said, that we always chose a source. So when you read an Amar Katha, especially on mythology or history, there's a source which is quoted. Like it is, the story here is based on such and such source, literary source. So here, let me take you through my search for the Lakshman Rekha, for the Amar Katha that I did on Ramcharitmanas, because we in the end decided between Valmiki and Ramcharitmanas, we would choose the Ramcharitmanas. So let's look for the Lakshman Rekha in the original sources. Now here is Tulsi Ramcharitmanas. These are the exact quotes, and as you'll see, that is underlined. That was the rule of the editorial, that you took from the source, and you had to also, when submitting your script, you had to give the original sources underlined. So here, let's see what happens is when Sita asks Lakshman to go and help Ram after Ram calls out, there is no Rekha. What he does is, Lakshman is asking for the sylvan gods and the deities presiding the quarters to look after her. So he says, "Van ki devtaon unki raksha karo," and then he goes to find Rama. In between, there is no drawing of the line, which we are so familiar with. Now here, let's look at Valmiki Ramayana. Valmiki Ramayana, which is the source of all the Ramayans that we know of from India and elsewhere, because it is the oldest version. Now here also he says that it is one ki sampurn devta aapki raksha kare. May the gods of the forest look after you, because I feel that they're very omens are very dangerous omens are there. Right? Now let's go to Adhyatmik Ramayana. Adhyatmik Ramayana is also a very, it is more of the spiritual story, and it's a source that is really looked up to. Now here too we have Sita ko वन देवियों को सौंपकर अत्यंत घिन होकर धीरे धीरे राम के पास गए. So what happens is, in the when we take a source like a story, stories, mythological stories are very fluid, and they, as they travel, they change. So when the Valmiki Ramayana goes from the north, and it goes and it gets translated into Bengali and Gujarati and Tamil and Telugu and Odia and Kannada, it takes on the garb of the local. It has a certain flavor of the local language and the local culture. The story remains the same, the culture remains the same, the events remain the same. There's a slight change in the detailing. So we find that if we compare these different Ramayans, we will find, if we scrutinize them in detail, from an academic point of view, we will find these changes which are there. Now this is the Bengali Ramayana. It does not have any mention of the Rekha either. This is, we come to another children's story, a National Books Trust children's book version, no Rekha. Here, this is a Gujarati Ramayana, and very interestingly, it mentions the Rekha, but it, as a footnote, it says that this is not a part of the original, it is added later. So here, this is Tamil Ramayana, is a Kamban Ramayana. It's a literary masterpiece, and it's very interesting that it has certain details which are not found in any of the other regional Ramayans. Now in Tamil Ramayana also, there is no Rekha, no nothing drawn by Lakshman. But what happens later is, there is a backstory of Ravan's interaction with Sita. According to Kamban Ramayana, Ravan was cursed that if he ever touched a woman against her will, he would die. So he does not touch Sita. He digs the earth beneath her in front of the hut, picks her up, puts her on the aerial chariot, and then he takes her and puts her in the Ashok Vatika. At no point does he touch her, because that is the curse upon him. So he cajoles her, he speaks to her, he says pleasant things, but he never ever dares to touch her. That is a detail that we get from Kamban Ramayana. Like I said, the regional stories have their own added versions. So in Kamban Ramayana also, we do not have the detail. So here, when we are doing the Ramcharitmanas, when we were doing our version, we took exactly as it was detailed in the original. So what does Lakshman say? Lakshman says, "O gods of the forest and deities of the cardinal directions, I leave Sita to your care." He does not draw the Lakshman Rekha. So what do we conclude? This is a Thai Ramayana. I'll come to it, because Ramayana traveled not only across India and got translated, it went across the subcontinent to other Asian countries, and it evolved with the different cultural nuances and the aesthetics that belong to that region. So what happens? What do we take? What is our takeaway from this detailing of the Lakshman Rekha? Now, even if it is not mentioned in any of these major sources, the fact that it exists in our collective conscious, the fact that we all believe in the existence of the Lakshman Rekha makes it more real. And it, for communication, or for a designer, for anybody who's going to deal with people, you have to remember that what exists in the popular culture, what resonates with people, what is there from centuries, is more real and is going to be more believable than anything you find from your sources. So if I'm writing, or if I'm telling a film, or writing for a film or a script, I would stick to the sources. But if I'm telling a story, I would tell all the versions, right? To anyone, because then all the versions have their own beauty. So because it is so strong, the idea of the Lakshman Rekha is so vivid in our minds. And in some of the visuals that we have seen, we remember that he either picks up an arrow or he picks up a twig and he makes that line. And if she tries to put her foot over it, there is fire. And then, and even in the sagas Ramayana, you have the visual of the Rekha being drawn, because that is a composite, as they say in the beginning of the Ramayana, on Sagas Ramayana on television, all the sources have been referred to. So what they have taken is what would best resonate and be best depicted in the visual medium, because a visual medium like television requires that kind of drama. Now, where did the story of the Lakshman Rekha come? At what point in history? We cannot say. Maybe during some Ram Leela, maybe during some oral narration, maybe during some translation, this idea came, and the idea was so powerful that it just stayed. So even if you hear this, you will not be able to accept the fact that Lakshman Rekha does not exist. And with the present circumstances where the Lakshman Rekha has become such a powerful tool of communication, we need to believe in it again, not as a physical line, but as a line as we understand, to go away from the mythological for a moment and think about the Tropic of Cancer or the equator. We know there is no physical line, yet when we cross it, we have this feeling of being at a very important juncture, a geographical marking. And there are, I think, places where they say this is the Tropic of Cancer you're crossing. And we feel that sense of excitement. So whether a physical line exists or not, the fact that it is so deeply embedded in our collective conscious makes it very relevant for us. Now, let's see what happens when the Ramayana goes across from India to other countries. Now, this is, if you have been to Thailand, in Bangkok, there is this Rama Temple. And on the walls of the temple, there are these beautiful scenes of the Ramayana drawn. And I think they are drawn, painted afresh every 10 years. And they have, and as you can see, everything changes, right? The costume changes, the ornament changes, the flora and fauna change. And the architecture is changed. And why is flora and fauna important in Ramayana? Because Ramayana has some of the most beautiful pastoral, poetic kind of descriptions of nature. And this also brings us to the fact of why is leaving Sita to the gods of deity, the gods of the forest important. It is something that we cannot understand today because we are so disconnected and we do not feel that we are a part of nature. But originally, if you look at the history of the country, if you look at our ecological connections traditionally, it was very natural to feel that nature was a part of us and that communication with nature was very natural and very accepted. So you also had, like in Shakuntala, you had a Gandharva Vivaha. You had a marriage that was sanctified and witnessed by nature. So nature was such a part of our lives earlier that you could have this connect and all the similes for the beauty and for everything that we described came from nature. So there was this strong connect which we have lost. So for us, it is difficult to understand the context of why that leaving Sita to the care of the sylvan gods is as strong as a line. Because for us, the context is changed. This is a very interesting Ramayana. It's a psychological interpretation of Ramayana, which I thankfully picked up and read later. I would not have understood it earlier if I had read it, if I had not the detail. And I needed somebody who had studied psychology to take me through it, but it's excellent. So you can take the Ramayana and you can interpret it from any filter that you have. any knowledge base that you have, and it will tell you a completely different story. So it is a really rich source, and if you really read in detail, you understand why it has been important through the ages and why telling of the Ramayana is such a rich force. Now, we are talk about our mythologies, and we presume that mythology is always connected to religion. It overlaps with religion. It derives from religion. It can be connected to religion, but it's not always synonymous to religion. You can read mythology, you can enjoy mythological stories, you can write about them without being invested in that faith. So any mythology from anywhere in the world, you will find the fascination, because the stories are so detailed, they are so well crafted, and always in all mythology from all over the world, in the end, after all the adventures, the war, the strife, the good always prevails over the evil. There is always, all mythology stories, take it from anywhere in the world, there is always, the good is always overpowering the evil forces. There is always a lot of very long, convoluted stories and adventures and mythical creatures and larger than life descriptions. But in the end, you know, even when you read something new, you know that in the end, the good will prevail over the evil. Now, we are familiar with mythology of our own country because we hear of it, either from a grandmother's tale, or we've watched this Ram Leela sometime, or you've seen on television, or you've heard little, because it is a part of our vocabulary. So much of the mythology has become a part of our vocabulary that somebody says Ramban, you know it is something that will always work. And when somebody's telling a long story, you say, oh God, Ram Katha shuru kar di, because you know it will be long and it will be convoluted. So it is, by mythology also becomes a part of our vocabulary. So whether you like it or not, mythology matters to you, whether you are invested in it actively or not. But what happens is, even across countries and cultures, some mythological references come to us which make immediate sense. Now, not many of us study Greek mythology, unless you are academically inclined to do so, or it's a part of your course. But all of us know what Narcissus was, right? We know if somebody is preening into a mirror, or somebody who's very self-obsessed, or he loves to look at his face, his or her face in the mirror, we say, what a narcissist. So we know of references of mythology which don't belong to our culture. Now, you may not know the whole story, you may not know what his parentage was and who was Echo or whatever, but you do know that a narcissist is somebody who is obsessed with his own image. Another Greek reference that makes sense to us, or it resonates with us, is Helen of Troy. Now, Helen of Troy is an example of beauty. Now, she was so beautiful, and so later when her beauty is said to be the cause of the war, now the Trojan War. And later, when you speak of Helen, you speak of Helen as the face that launched 1,000 ships. So that is her beauty. Now, this fact, this is a very, it's something that I like a lot, is because you take mythology and you can play with it. You use it in a witty way, because there was at a point of time, I think it's still already there in the references, is that if the beauty of Helen, beauty is not quantifiable. It's in the eye of the beholder. So you can't really quantify beauty, but we do try. We do say 8 on 10, 10 on 10, whatever. So this Helen was taken as the highest point of beauty. And so you have a Millie Helen. So you have a beauty which would launch maybe one ship. So this is there. This is like a clever ruse of using mythology in a witty manner. Now, here we go to another source of Ramayana. In other countries, where it becomes, takes on a completely different role. So if you go to Bali, you go to Indonesia, there are performances and there are songs and dances, and which we will not find in India at all. They have the local costume, they have the local songs, the names of the characters are changed. Sometimes even the characteristics are slightly changed. The personalities and the way they interact are changed, but it has such a rich, vibrant existence of its own after going that has taken on, that it could have really been, it has grown. It's like a homegrown culture of Ramayana, which is such a strong part of Indonesia. Another reference that all of us are very familiar with, like the Lakshman Rekha, is Arjun and the eye of the bird. Now, this is used now so often in management and in concentration studies and in meditation, and because it is the fact that Arjun aims at the eye of the bird, and when he's doing that, he can't see anything else beside the eye of the bird. And so this story can be told in a very long, detailed way, where you have each of the princes coming, and how they when they're asked what they can see, they all explain what they can see: the sky, and they can see the palace, and they can see this, that, and the other. And how Arjun is the only one who can see. He refuses. He says he can't even see the bird. He can only see the eye of the bird. Now, this is something that is again so common that it's used in a serial, like for some hero pining for a girl, said, okay, you are Arjun, and that's the bird, eye of the bird. So that is an immediate understanding of what you have to concentrate on. Of course, it can be used in other references also, of being completely focused on or having a very clear aim in life. Now, what happens with things that are so old and with us for generations? Like I said, mythology stories are like a collective wisdom of a community, of a culture that is passed on from generation to generation. But sometimes over the period of time, things change. The social norms change, and some things don't immediately make sense to us. We are not able to understand because our life has changed so much in the interim. So if you take taking this example of the Ramayana of the Sagas, which is being shown on television, after some years, the Sagas decided to put together a show called Gurukul on Star Plus, I think it was, where again I was brought in because of my culture and mythology background, and I scripted this 1 year long program. So it was a magazine program in which we had mythology and Gita and astrology and stories and festivals and all kinds of what we would come under the umbrella of Indian culture. But what we did here, very interestingly, is that we took the Ramayana episodes from the Ramanand Sagar's original, but we looked at them afresh to understand what would they mean to us today in the contemporary times. Take the case of something like the Balram, when Ram is small, young, as a baby, and he pines for the moon, right? He sees the moon and he wants it. And so then everybody is very upset because Ram is crying. And so how they assuage his feelings and how they bring this parat and they put water in it and he sees the reflection of the moon and he's happy. So the point one, that is a story told. But at another level, you can look at it as a parenting story, right? How do you, if a child is throwing a tantrum, or if a small child who's too young to be explained anything, how do you deal with him without hurting his feelings and by distracting him in a positive way? So it could be taken as a parenting lesson. So we took, or when you go later to the Gurukul part. Now, when the 4 princes are leaving for the Gurukul, what is the ceremony? What does it mean? And why it does not resonate? Why do we have just a ritual now? Because it is not that you're leaving your parents for 8 to 10 years and you're not going to see them. That was the time, that was the way the Gurukuls operated in those days. You left your parents and you were away for such a long time, say for that ceremony before the Gurukul and the ceremony of the Snatak were so deep and so deep with meaning. So now we have, when we have a graduation program in all the colleges, and when we want to translate, we say Snatak, right, in Hindi or in the language. What is forgotten is the connotation of Snatak is actually, it literally means the bathed one. It's not that people who are in the Gurukul didn't bathe earlier, they did, but all the perfumes and the unguents and the upton and, you know, the flowers that were in a ceremonial bath was given once the student passed out from the Gurukul. So therefore, he was called the bathed one, right? So that is the idea of today also. When you have, you're graduating from college, you're called a Snatak. But I think nobody remembers the connect to the bathing situation. Now, let's take some guessing game. Now, these are again some references which immediately make sense to us, even if we just speak about them in an everyday conversation. So when you call somebody a Kumkaran, you know it is somebody who sleeps a lot, who needs to be woken up with great difficulty. Here too in Kumkaran, very interestingly, as a child, I had heard the story of Kumkaran, you know, praying and asking for a boon from Brahma. And because he had prayed for so long, he was going to ask for Indrasan. He wanted to take on the position of Indra. And the other gods were a little worried. So they asked Saraswati to sit on his tongue, and so that he would, instead of asking for Indrasan, he would ask for Nindrasan. Now, this is a story which is in my mind, but I've not been able to find it in the sources. But it is a story that it really makes sense to us. And it's easy to remember the Indrasan and the Nindrasan and the play on words. But it may be there in some reference somewhere. It's not there in all the sources. Now, another character from Ramayana is Vibhishan. Now, Vibhishan is a positive character by all means. If you read the Ramayana, he's really a very different person from the rest of the people in Lanka. But in a common proverbs, he goes down as Ghar ka bhedi Lanka dhai, right? So somebody who is breaks away from the family or the community is going to bring you know, wreck and ruin to the community or the family. So he has, in retrospect, he's been painted rather negatively. Bharat Milap. We all know Bharat Milap is somebody, is when people meet after a long time. There's a lot of, there's a sorrow of being apart. There is a very long embrace, which is now not possible in these days. But Bharat Milap always has this idea of two people who meet after a long time, and there's a lot of emotional background to them, very attached and very close to each other, and how important it is for them to meet. Bringing the entire mountain, we know this about, instead of bringing one jari booty, you bring the entire mountain. So when you ask somebody to do one task, and instead of that they do a very exaggerated you know, response, then you say, okay, just bringing the whole mountain. Kobhavan is something that not everybody is familiar with. Kobhavan is a very interesting idea in the Ramayana, that when you're angry, you go to a big room which is very dark, and it is a dismal place. It has no windows, and you are there in that Kobhavan either till you get over your anger on your own, or somebody you know, pacifies you and cools your anger down and brings you out. So Kekai and Kobhavan are two linked situations, because when Kekai wants to ask Dashrath for the boons, she goes to Court Bhavan. So this idea, so now we do not have a physical Court Bhavan, but when somebody is sulking, we use the term Court Bhavan mein. That means it's going to be a long time before they can be brought back into the normal conversation. Arjun and the Eye of the Bird, we spoke about how it immediately, it means the concentration of the aim of being completely oblivious of everything else but what you are focusing on. It's a very, very strong idea that immediately makes sense to anybody in India. And of course, this would make sense to students. Burden like Atlas. Why is Atlas burdened? Because he's carrying the world on his back. And that is how many times we feel that this is what is happening to us, is that we feel burdened by the amount of work that we have on our backs. So we can take any of these clues and discuss them. If there are other mythological cues that you feel are important, then we can discuss that. And I would really like to emphasize that mythology is really, really important to us. And it is not etched in stone. It changes over time. It changes as it travels from one place to another over translation. But it is a part of our lives. We own it. We can be a part of it. We can even criticize it. We can critique it. We can question it. We can have enact it. It is our collective heritage. And so we should be able to connect it to it in a very positive way. And I'm saying this because I found a very strange example, because I teach creative writing and I teach introduction to Indian culture in my schools. And in the creative writing exercise, normally on the first day I give I give an icebreaker exercise to see what their level of language is. And so I asked them to give a story, and I asked them to complete it. Like the story is half written, and then I have about 25-30 stories, common folk tales and stories from mythology, which I give them, and I ask them to complete it in any which way they want. The story can go anywhere they want. And one of the students came back and said, I can't write this story. And I said, what happened? So she said, it was the story of that Balram and the moon and wanting the moon. And it was only up to the point of he wants the moon and he cries for the moon, and the story had to be completed. But she came back and said, nahi likh sakti. I said, what happened? He said, nahi, ye hame likhna allowed nahi hai. I gave her another story, but I was a little disturbed by the fact that we have fear where mythology is concerned. There should be no fear. It belongs to all of us. And we can, the very fact that there is no one story, there's no one source, there's no one way of telling it, that it can change over time, that it can change over geographical areas, that can change as it goes from country to country. It can change when it takes in theater or in dance or sculpture. The fluidity, the flexibility of it is a boon. And the narrating of a story, especially in the oral tradition, because all stories, all mythology obviously began by the spoken word. So the oral tradition of speaking or telling a story makes it really so elastic, so flexible, that supposing I'm telling a story to somebody and I find that, and it happens to me in class, I find that they are completely invested in it, they're very interested, I would go into greater detail and I would go into side stories and come back, and it would be a long narration. Whereas if I find that I'm not catching their attention, I'll just wind it up quickly. So if I'm telling a story to a child, I will create that, what we call the Purva Bhumika. I would make it fun and interesting and with a lot of laughter to come to the actual climax of it. So the freedom of telling the story in your way, and the fact that the audience, whoever is listening to the story, is also adds to it in the imagination. So it's a two-way process. The narration of a mythology is always a two-way process. Supposing I'm telling the story and I decide to add a little song to it, and I find the audience is also singing along with me, it would take another life of its own. So we should all feel really connected to our mythology. We should be happy. We have such a vast ocean of mythological stories, and we should be able to connect it even to our work. Like if you're doing a project as a designer, I assure you there is a story which will tell your point of view much better. And of course, there is the distinction between the Ramayana and the Mahabharata being the ideal and the real, right? Ramayana has the ideal characters and Mahabharata has life as it really is. And there is even a challenge that there is nothing in life, real life, that you won't find in Mahabharata. And there's nothing in Mahabharata that you will not find in real life. And that is something you can try on if you really read in detail, which is true. You will find parallels to the events and the stories that you find in Mahabharata. So let us take this time to think of how are we going to interpret these stories for our times. Is there somebody writing the story now? Is there another way of telling our mythology in the present days? Are we be able to interpret it from our context? Because we should be able to retell the stories and add our version to it and our understanding for it, make it richer, different, and it without taking away from the authenticity or the richness of the original. We can have one more version of any of the mythological stories. So let us reinvest in mythology, just as mythology, either as a belief system or a story well told. So let mythology matter to us in our lives, and let us be invested and celebrate the mythology that we have inherited. Thank you. This is to thank, I must thank all the students I've ever taught. It is because of, this is done by one of my recent students, is because of the students of the design school that I teach in and the journalism that I have really moved from writing to teaching as a full-time passion. So a big thanks to all my students who listen to me and encourage me to teach. Are there any questions?
Hi, Bala. I think we can't hear you. Are you mute? Hi, Bala. Sure. Hi, there was some issue with Bala's microphone. I think he's not able to talk.
Yeah.
There are a few questions in the Q&A panel.
Okay, I'll just have a look at it.
Yes.
Give me a minute. Okay, there's one question which says, were you able to trace the oldest mention of Lakshman Rekha, either literary source or oral version? Also, has it something to do with society in which it would have been made, the patriarchy or any system? Definitely, yes. So what I tried to do was look at the sources which are taken as the popular Ramayana sources. That's why we went across to Valmiki Ramayana and the Kamban Ramayana and the Ramcharitmanas. But I feel at some point it was because Ram Leela is really a very popular method of telling the story of Ram. So somewhere I feel in the performative version, in the Ram Leela, this must have been shown. I have not come across. I have really tried to find a source where I find, and it's usually in the translation that it comes, in an English translation, where there's, it's usually not from a single source, and it's the later versions. And Lakshman Rekha for a very long time was used repeatedly to tell women about their limits. I mean, in common parlance, right? In theater or in films or in serials, it's always the women. So I feel it's a good sign that now this time Lakshman Rekha is not only for women. So I think something is to be celebrated. I think there's a change here, and we don't take note of these things. But it hasn't. It didn't say that the women stay and the men can like break the lock down and go. So I think it's a very healthy progress that for so many years, Lakshman Rekha was always used to keep women within what was prescribed as their limits. And now it is just for everybody to know what societal norms are. So it is not as negative as it used to be even some years ago, because I can definitely, you as a media, you also observe what are the what media is throwing at you. So you understand, you look at even films you cannot see, enjoy them as others do, because you keep reading between the lines or between the frames, if it were. So I feel somehow this time, I think I'm talking about Lakshman Rekha because I'm really happy that it's not only for women. It's something to be celebrated. We're all there, and it's all for your good, and it's a very positive connotation of Lakshman Rekha. So yeah, we're moving on. But if I'm still looking for it, if I do find a source, I think it is very important for me. I have time to read. So I'm looking for maybe in somewhere where I will feel historically where it crept in and why it was accepted is very, very obvious. It would be very, very interesting for anybody who's telling a story from the male point of view to keep women in control. So it would be a very attractive add-on in those days. In your perspective, how much of mythology could be true and how much of it is fabricated? Some contests it being pure fiction, other defended being based off the country's origin. Yes, it is. Like I said, there are two very, very opposing views. There are people who, I can tell you, people who object to Ramayana and Mahabharata and the stories being classified in a literature classification as mythology. There have been people who have complained that you cannot call Ramayana mythology because they presume the moment you put it under mythology, you are saying it is not true, which is not a fact. And there are some people who completely feel that I cannot identify with that. I think we have to come somewhere in between. Nobody tells you to believe every word of it, but there's certainly a takeaway from the story that you will, which you will agree to as a general moral fabric of the times, not forever, but of the times. And the stories do, there are a lot of things that go and reflect society. Let me give you a simple example of when, again, I'm sticking to Ramayana because we're on that mode, that when Hanuman comes back and he brings a memento from Sita and he brings a Chudamani and Ram shows it to Lakshman and said, do you recognize it? Don't you know this is, do you think this is Sita's? And Lakshman says, I wouldn't know. I have never looked up, right? So Lakshman says, I have never looked beyond her feet. I have never looked at her. So I do not know if this hair ornament belongs to her. So it tells you what the relationship is, that Lakshman would not even look up when he spoke to Sita. So it's not that we have to take it literally, but you can, if you do not believe in it, if you do not prescribe to the religious part of it, you can definitely relate to the ethics, the spiritual, and the story as it reflects the times when you read different versions of it. So it is important to us. And like I said, whether you like it or not, it impinges in our lives. You can't escape. You understand, you already know the codification, right? You respond to it. So it's a part of our life. May have been improvised for different cultures. This question says, as mythological stories may have been improvised as per different cultures, it seems like the user-centered design approach, which can have serious ethical issues in today's socio-political scenario. People may take advantage of the elasticity of the story and rewrite the same with their interests. What's your take? Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, very dangerously so, that now that digitizing is possible, I have seen stories of all kinds across religions being rewritten. So if I am taking a source for anything that I'm doing for research, I really would not take anything that has been in print recently. I honestly look for an old source, because it is very easy now to play on with books also, which are origin sources. And this happens across. It's not just mythology, but even biographies and like quotations from famous people. Something they never even thought of is being used now. It's very easy to interpolate and put ideas into even what is considered original sources. So it depends on what you read, where you read from, and whether, and it's always possible to go to the original source and authenticate it. There's also, I think, people play on the fear that mythology is very complex. It's all in Sanskrit. It will not be decipherable for me. I can never find out what the origin. Of course not. Everything is available in good translation. You can find it. If somebody tells you this is so-and-so is there in the, ask them which is the source, give me the exact chapter, shlok, and you can look it up. And I have found this. I have had to fight this when I was doing television all the time. People making claims that were completely impossible, and as a gut feeling, I knew it could not be true. So I asked them for a reference, and sure enough, I would find that it has actually nothing to do with the original. But they presume that because they are quoting either Ved or Sushruta Samhita or whatever, that I would be taken. But I would go back and say, give me the exact reference. Once you have the exact reference, you can compare notes. It's all there. So we should not be, if somebody says something, listen to it. If it's only to give a message, fine. But if it is being claimed as something authentic and something that is, you are supposed to change according to, then you can question it and you can go back to the sources. So telling a story is fine. Living your life by that is fine. Telling other people to live their lives by that you have a right to find out and question and follow your heart and your mind. Authors and storytellers are constrained by fate, as in the case of Salman Rushdie. Okay, that's a long answer. Yes, you are. But the fact that you can also tell a story of a mythology, of a religion without belonging to it, and you can do a really good job of it. It is not necessary to be deep in that faith to be able to narrate the mythology of that faith. It's really not necessary. And I can say that with complete confidence, because I know people who are not necessarily believers, but yet they can tell the story or they relate to the characters in a very strong way, in a non-religiously rigid way. And I think one has to also understand the enormous possibilities a Hindu religion gives you. So you can relate to the gods in different ways. See, we have people like, especially in the Vaishnavite tradition, you can look at Krishna as a god. You can look at him with Vatsalya, right? Many people love to worship Bal Ram or Bal Krishna because it's easy to bring out your maternal instinct and spoil them silly by making things for them. And so it's a Vatsalya bhav. It can be a Sakha bhav. It can be how the other cowherds or the gopis relate to Krishna. It can be the Krishna and Arjun, where he looks up and he's a person who counsels him. So there are at least minimum 7 ways of relating to the god. And you can choose. They can also be the Shant and the Kant bhav, where there is also a relationship which is not legitimate from the social point of view, but which makes the striving so much more different. And we have this continuous parallels between the earthen love, the earthy love, and the surreal or the supernatural one. And those are found in all belief systems, where it is not an earthly love. It is talking about earthly love, but we are really talking about the soul and the universal soul being united. So there are always layers. None of these stories are single stratified layers. They're always a layer. Even when you look at even the bhakti poetry, if you look at just Tulsi and Kabir and Rahim and Ras Khan, even in school you had Shabdarth, right? The literal meaning of the words. And you had Bhavarth, which is the deeper meaning. What are they trying to say in those 2 sentences? So there are always ways of understanding. And if we trust ourselves, we can understand. And I feel children definitely do understand. There is no need to simplify stories or to, give them the basic structure of the story. They understand complexities and they take out whatever meaning they need to from there. So you can even tell them multiple versions of the story and they'll get it. I find simplification of stories for children completely unnecessary. Does the concept of evil Ramayana justified when Raman didn't touch Sita the whole time and Ram just abandoned her after listening to his minister about virgins who were not present at the time? Okay, this is again a lot of versions about, like I said, you can take the characters of Ramayana or Mahabharata and you can have a healthy discussion about what you think about them. And when I was younger, like we people discuss now actors and actresses, which one is your favorite, or sports people, right? You discuss and you kind of defend the person you like and you kind of criticize the person the other way. There used to be discussions like this about characters and you would find the flaws and you defend that. So that was the whole point, that the gods also had human frailties. And it is a way of understanding behavior, understanding interpersonal relationships by looking at that. And the Ravan not touching Sita, this whole thing about, I think in the Bengali Ramayana, very interestingly, it says Mrig, when the golden Mrig comes, right? At the point in which the golden deer is introduced in the story. And the translator said it's very important, because if there was no golden deer, there would be no Ramayana to tell, right? So up to then it's all there. And that is the big twist in the story. The golden deer, Ravan coming, taking Sita away, the search for Sita, all the story begins, the twist in the tale begins from there. So it's an important part. But here, like I said, you look at Ravan and you look at even the way Ravan is perceived in different narrations. And you look at Mandodari and Ravan's relationship. It's very interesting. And it's very, very complex. If you look at the versions of how the Sita's birth, it's very complex. And sometimes I wonder if at a platform like this, if I discuss it, people would not understand, because this is how it is. There are various versions of the story, and you can take the versions and understand what happens at different narrations. What are the possible meanings of how did Sita be found under that the furrow? Okay? And this concept of Ravan not touching Sita, like I said, in Kamban Ramayana, it's very, very clear that he doesn't touch her. And even in the other Ramayans, even when they show him picking her up physically, or even I think in some pulling by the hair, I have some memory of watching something where he pulls her by the hair. It's a very horrible, cruel act. But in Kamban Ramayana, you have this fact that he doesn't touch her. And later when he's there, at no point does Ravan persuade Sita by anything else than arguments. He tries to woo her. He tells her how wonderful it would be, or how great he is and all that. And she manages to hold her fort because of her attachment to Ram. So that is another narrative. But yes, if it is, and Ravan is not all evil. If you look at Ravan, he doesn't come out as all evil. If you look at his, the whole story, it doesn't come out as a negative person. Is there a design within myth? Like, are there structures mentioned by, now that I wouldn't know. I am not a design person, but if there are structures, yes, I'm not familiar with this. Are there layers in a myth? Yes, I said there are a lot of, and the moment you unravel it, you understand that what is said what you understand at the first reading or the first hearing is not all. There are layers in it, and depending on my ability to comprehend and my background and my assimilative power, I will take away different layers from a story that is told to a number of people at one time. Yes, Salman Rushdie is a big favorite. I really don't feel I want to discuss him. It would break my heart. Yes, he had to suffer a lot, but he is well read, and I'm a great admirer of Rushdie. Does the concept of evil and just fell around? Okay, we didn't. That's, I think it's come again. Am I missing any question? Wait. Let me find some other answers. How are we doing for time? Bala? How can we?
It's 5:21. We are 21 minutes ahead.
Okay, okay. Let me try and see if I can.
We are spilling 21 minutes.
Okay. He had to suffer the concept of evil. This. Some questions are repeated. Were you able to trace? No. Is there, can you find a question which I have not touched upon? Can you go through the questions? Because I feel that I have answered most of the questions that I find in the question answer. Have I missed anything? I think a question came in earlier. What is the harmful effect of mythology? Not really. I mean, it's how can I convince children? Slide should be useful.
I think we can take one more question now.
Yeah, I think there was a question that came.
A question by Shubham Tambi.
Huh? Yeah. 1 minute. There was a question which came, I think, before we started about how does mythology connect with the present times of mythology in Corona times. I think it's a very interesting concept because my background is actually microbiology, and microbiologists are now being presented all over the world as people who you should listen to. So it is honestly, if you look at what is happening now, I mean,
yes,
I didn't
there was a question which
the question that had come in before we began the session was about how would you interpret the present. Must be the first question. Let me scroll down. It was about how
COVID-19 situation.
Yeah, wasn't it? So I kind of remember that how would you relate mythology and the present times? I think I would really love to do this exercise with some students, because what we need to do is write down or think of what has happened. What are the things that we were doing? And you look at it not as a mythology in the sense of humans, but look at nature versus humans. The fact of human beings living as if they are the only, inhabitants of planet Earth. And what has happened now, what is happening right now, and what is the effect on nature. So could you construct a mythology around it? I think it is possible. It is possible, and I would really love to do it the first class I ever have with any of the students of either journalism design, because I think their ideas would be wonderful, and you can really match what happened before and what could be in a very vivid imaginary way, where the rest of the animate world decides to put man in his place. I mean, you could think of it, right? And we, in so many ways, we've been really put into where we belong because of something that we cannot see and we don't understand at all. And we just presume that we know because we know the RNA structure. So it's a very demanding, and it can be a very interesting exercise. And I would love to be able to write this story visually, vividly, with some young people, putting before and after and what has happened. If you make a list of what we were doing wrong, as the generation before, what has happened, how the resources have been depleted, or what has happened to climate change, how we become self-centered, and how money is everything. So many things which are very apparent, but we close our eyes to it. And suddenly, a lot of these factors have started appearing in our lives. And so if this is meant to, in the mythological sense, to at the cost of so many lives, at the cost of so much mayhem, so much of death, to teach you a lesson, what would the lesson be? And what would the life after that, after this is over, what would our takeaway be? Would it be more empathy? Would it be more connectedness? Would it be more closer to willy-nilly everybody has now found family time, right? Would it be communities or families being more important than what is happening right now? I don't know. I'm not, I don't want to sound like preachy, but you can, it's there in your face, what is happening around. So if you just make an observation of what has happened to you personally, to people around you, to what you see or what you hear, and list that with what was happening earlier on a larger global scale, I think the story will play itself out, definitely. And I think you need multiple versions of it. So just my story would not be enough. You need different, and it really works. I've tried this in classrooms and it really works. They come up with amazing stuff. So yeah, I'm looking forward to whenever we have an online, real, whatever class we have with students whose imagination is much, much better than mine. It'd be wonderful to do this exercise of mythology in the Corona times. Yeah. Is there any question that, any other question?
No, thank you, Margie. It was a very interesting, very exciting, very insightful session, and I think we enjoyed a lot. And we had so many questions.
We'll try and see. I think we will have the questions with us, right? So we'll try and see
yes.
if we can answer them in some other format, maybe.
I think I'll make a note of the questions and I can send it to you if you're interested.
Yeah.
We'll yeah, but we have a lot of questions.
Sure, we'll try. We'll try and take it.
Yeah, I think most of you already answered.
Yeah.
But it was a very interesting session, and I think a very different session than what people expected. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Bala, for hosting it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye.